Hello and welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, doing a solo episode for the waiver wire this week. This should be a pretty quick episode. Unfortunately, not going to do trade targets today. A lot happened, so getting the waiver wire situated. Maybe we'll do a bonus episode later in the week for some trade targets, but I do think focusing on the waiver wire because there are a lot of guys that got hurt this week that generated, especially at the wide receiver position, that generated some interest here on the waiver wire. So I think you should do your best to get your bench set up and then maybe look into some trades. Unfortunately, a lot of really good players hurt, right? I mean, Brandon Ayuk out, Evans and Godwin both out. Evans expected back week 12, but Godwin out for the year. There's just a lot of unfortunate situations here. Deshaun Watson out for the year, Achilles injury, right? So we're going to talk about Winston here in a little bit, and then some teams coming off buys, some trade situations that might open up some additional personnel here. So without further ado, let's get into the first player here. And my out of the week is somebody that I want you to check in on because I did see him get dropped in quite a few leagues that I was in, and I was very surprised about that. But going into his bye week, Rome Odunze was somebody that was getting dropped quite a bit. So I want to check all my leagues for Rome Odunze, see if he's out there. There is a pretty good track record of rookie wide receivers that are very talented, that get involved in the offense early, come out of the bye week, and are significantly more involved. And I think that's going to happen with Odunze here. He's been playing on almost all the snaps, right? I mean, he's been up in the 80s percent roughly snap shares, and he has multiple games in a row now, 3 straight games after kind of his breakout game where he didn't do much, right? 1 for 10, 5 for 40, and 2 for 40. And we did see Keenan Allen catch 2 touchdowns in week 6 against Jacksonville. So I don't know. I understand people with Rome might be getting frustrated, and that's why he ended up dropped. He is owned in 73% of leagues. So there's a fairly good chance he is still owned in your league. But just in case he got cut, go and make sure that you add him. He should be 100% owned. I really think over the second half of the year, the Bears have one of the easiest passing game schedules for wide receivers. And I do think that he should continue to flourish and step up even more into that number 2 role ahead of Kmet and ahead of Keenan Allen, who, have kind of been producing better than him through the first 6 weeks of the year. So go look for Rome Odunze. The next 2 guys I want to get into are quarterbacks. Right, we're obviously here to talk from Superflex perspective, so there are some other quarterbacks that maybe are available in your 1 quarterback leagues. But from a Superflex angle, make sure you go and check in on Russell Wilson. Make sure that he is owned. There's a chance anyways that people thought in your league that Justin Fields was going to take the job back, that Russ would struggle into halftime, Fields would take back over. Maybe Russ wasn't like a race to the waiver wire guy to get, and he goes out and absolutely balls out against the Jets, like arguably the top passing defense in the league. And I know the Jets are a little bit banged up on defense, but Russ just shredded them. I mean, multiple touchdowns, over 250 yards, deep balls to Pickens looked great. They just were able to open up a new gear on offense in terms of passing with Russ. I do think that he's going to be a viable starter for your Superflex leagues moving forward. Even in 1 QB leagues, he might get some looks, but definitely make sure that he's owned. And this is somebody, again, 25% plus FAAB on him in your Superflex leagues. The other guy that came available this week and that I expect to start, but there's at least a little bit of murkiness with Dorian Thompson-Robinson, but I do think that Jameis Winston is the quarterback that I would want there. I think even if they do go to DTR, that it's only a matter of time before he starts to struggle again and they end up turning it over to Winston. I don't know entirely what happened with making Winston inactive on game day. That felt to me like trying to reduce the calls for him to start over Deshaun Watson, right? I mean, they have so much money invested into Deshaun Watson, they weren't going to move on from him. But now that he's injured, maybe that opens the door for Winston to take over. Winston took like a leadership role too in defending Watson, whatever. I don't know if that helps his case at all in terms of on the field, but definitely check in on Winston. That is who I would be trying to target. And maybe you're able to get away with like 10% of your FAAB, 12% of your FAAB on Winston in your Superflex leagues because of the murkiness around DTR potentially starting here. They do have their bye in week 10, right? So we're going into week 8. So there's 2 weeks before their bye week. Maybe even after that, they decide to go to Winston, even if it is DTR early. So this is somebody that we've been telling you to stash. We didn't think it was necessarily going to work out this way, but he's somebody that I would be trying to get onto my rosters if at all possible in your Superflex leagues. Moving over to the receivers now, right? So I mentioned Rome at the top, but I do want to get into the ones that are likely more available, all less than 50% available here, and some of them less than 10%, right? A lot of these guys are going to be significantly available. And so the first one is Jauan Jennings. So we saw him be very successful without Debo on the field in week 3, right? And he hasn't had a ton of production other than that one game. And I know that one game was like 40 points, right? And so without Debo and Ayuk kind of getting up to speed still in week 3 after the holdout, it was kind of just the perfect storm for him to take over against the Rams defense that wasn't very good early in the year. So he's kind of fallen back into the reserve role. I mean, I don't know. He hasn't been super good or anything, but it's reasonable when he's not on the field as much. Down in the 50% snap shares. I do think that goes back up to the 80s now that Ayuk is out. So I would be trying to get Jauan Jennings. He's probably the number one receiver that I would go after if Odunze is not available. But the other thing about Jennings that I have pause on just in general is that he is somebody that, unfortunately, it looks like the 49ers are going to try and add a receiver. So, I don't know if he's going to just get the runway to be the starter like we would just all want him to when we're picking him up. If I had that kind of confidence, I would be saying 15, 20% here to try and get him back on your team. But because we have that hanging over our heads, and because the next guy on the same team that we're going to be talking about is kind of back from his injury, I guess we can say, I don't know how crazy I'd go on Jauan Jennings. I kind of think that there still might be a crowd here eventually, and if you're not going to play him this week, he is coming off an injury too, right? I mean, he didn't play this past week because he was out hurt, and then they have their bye next week in week 9. So it's like, if you spend a bunch of money, you might not play him this week, and then you can't play him in week 9. So, for those reasons, I'd pump the brakes maybe a little bit. The next guy we're talking about, obviously mentioned him just now, Ricky Pearsall, also on this 49ers offense, first round pick. They love him after the catch. They tried to get him involved in the second half of the game quite a bit. He had 3 catches in the second half. So, with Ayuk going down, maybe Ricky Pearsall is the guy that kind of gets a little bit more run here too in the offense. And especially if Debo, right, he was taken to the hospital, has pneumonia. So if he misses the game, both of these guys should be pretty solid plays coming up this week before their bye week. So Ricky Pearsall, another guy that's more like a $0 bid for me, very available. So if you can go out and get Pearsall to the end of your bench, he's somebody that feels like if they add a receiver and they have Jauan Jennings playing, he might end up being the first guy that you cut for next week's waiver wire. So don't go crazy on Pearsall in my. The next guy down also, unfortunately, is due to a injury situation. And this is a double injury situation in Tampa Bay, right? And so the guy I'm talking about is Jalen McMillan. So he is the rookie receiver that the Buccaneers picked. He was playing early in the year. He was actually playing on all the 3 wide receiver sets. He won the third wide receiver job out of camp, was playing on like 80% of snaps. And then he got hurt. He missed 2 games and barely played in his first game back. And Sterling Shepard had kind of stepped up. It looked like maybe Shepard was going to keep that role. But now, right, McMillan kind of racked up his targets at the end of the game, but he had 8 targets in this game against Baltimore, kind of his first one back at kind of more than 50% here. So with the injuries to Godwin and to Evans, McMillan is probably going to step up as the number 1 outside receiver. Shepard, kind of operates in the slot anyways, and Godwin was in the slot, allowing McMillan to play on the outside when he won that 3rd wide receiver job. And so I do expect him to kind of line up and be the predominant wide receiver on the outside for this team in the interim. This is another team now that needs to go and get a receiver at the trade deadline, right? So another team in on receiver. I mean, we're going to have to do a wide receiver trade episode eventually, once all these guys kind of settle after the trade deadline and really look at all these new situations. So until then, though, and they're maybe going to add one guy, right? And that's not going to take away from Jalen McMillan. I don't think it's going to take whoever they bring in to time to get up to speed. And I think 22-year-old rookie, could be in pretty good position here to take over as the number 1 outside option that could translate into 7 targets, maybe get some downfield stuff from Baker. And Baker's been playing awesome, right? So if McMillan is getting open at all, I do think Baker will be able to get him the ball pretty efficiently. And hopefully this offense will still have some semblance of being able to move the ball. Otton obviously looked great. We'll talk about him later. Rashad White looked great in the passing game. Maybe he takes on a little bit more of the role until they bring somebody else in or until Evans is back. But Jalen McMillan, the guy here, 6% roster, go and get him on your rosters, especially if you lost Evans or Godwin this week. The other receivers here that I want to talk about, and I'm going to go by increasing ownership percentage. So the first guy here should be owned in hardly any leagues. Everybody that's listening to this should be able to go and get Cedric Tillman. He's only 2% rostered. And after the trade of Amari Cooper for the Browns, Tillman was the one who stepped up, right? I mean, he played on a ton of snaps, over 80% of the snaps, and ran just as many routes as Judy and Njoku, right? So it was like, I was kind of thinking Judy would step up and Elijah Moore would be the guy, but then it was like, wait, Tillman is the guy that they're locking on to. Tillman is the guy getting all these targets. He had 12 targets in this game, 8 for 81. So he also averaged 10 a catch. Like, he didn't score. He did get a 2-point conversion, so they did throw it to him, down on the goal line for the 2-point play. But also, it's just, I don't know. He was way more involved than I thought. This is a second-year player for them. Maybe this was kind of their game plan, is once they moved on from Amari, they were going to give him a lot more run. And so go and get him, because this is a very interesting waiver ad here. And I think this is one of the guys that I would probably have him third, honestly, of the guys I want to add. McMillan's situation is at least a little bit murky, and he might get number one corner coverage. Tillman's not going to get that. So they move Tillman around the formation. So I think overall, and Judy gets the number one treatment. So if Tillman is going to be running this many routes and racking up targets, I think he's probably my third priority behind Odunze and Jauan Jennings. The second guy here owned in 8% of leagues. So again, very, very available is Troy Franklin. He had 5 for 50 this week, and maybe that Bo Nix Troy Franklin connection is starting to develop a little bit. Bo Nix obviously looks I should say from a fantasy perspective, is much better than we were expecting. He did miss some throws, and there was a lot of social media discussion around him, I guess, to put it nicely. But I do think that Franklin is kind of stepping up here, and this is an interesting thing to follow and would be interesting to get in front of, because I think there's a chance that Courtland Sutton gets traded before the deadline, even with the Broncos looking like they're in it from a real life perspective. Selling Sutton would be in their best interest to continue to build, and Franklin could kind of step into that number one role in the passing game. He had a couple bad drops early, but he does know Bo Nix really well, and I think if Sutton is traded, that Franklin is in a good spot here in this offense that seems to be improving and being able to at least move the ball here, right? So I think Franklin could be a part of that moving forward. The guy that has the highest ownership percentage at wide receiver that I want to talk about, 33%, is Jalen Tolbert. There's a pretty good chance that he got dropped going into his bye week, right? He's coming out of his bye week now, and for Dallas, if you're not familiar. And I do think that he's uniquely positioned here with a very good schedule. The Cowboys, Dallas, has a very easy passing schedule coming up, similar to the Bears. And I do think that Tolbert is going to have to be involved in that if they're going to be able to reach their ceiling as a team. So I do think that Tolbert is worth an ad, worth a look. 2 weeks before the bye week, he was excellent. He actually outperformed CeeDee Lamb in that game. And I think coming out of the bye, easy schedule, going to get number 2, maybe even number 3 coverage with Ferguson in the mix there. And I think better days and productive days are ahead for Jalen Tolbert. So if you have a spot or want to try and take a shot on a younger, relatively talented player, I think that's the guy you want to try and target. Going down to running back, there's only 2 names here that I put on this video. Unfortunately, the running backs are it's very, very difficult out there at running back right now. Not really very many injuries. But the 2 names here, one of them is Jaylen Warren. He's kind of coming back from his own injury. And I know Najee had one of his best games, but I do think with Russell Wilson, it does open up the running game quite a bit, right? They're going to see a lot less stacked boxes. We saw that in the very first game with Russ behind center. And Warren actually played almost 50% of the snaps in this one. So I think, too, without having Fields run the ball when he gets in trouble, Russ is going to check it down. And those plays are generally going to go to Jaylen Warren, especially if he's on the field on third down, or if he plays any first or second down snaps, which I expect his role to increase. I think that Russell Wilson kind of is a tide that's rising all ships in the passing game. And I think Warren is going to be uniquely positioned to take advantage of that. So we had high hopes for him coming into the year. Very efficient player. He's just has not been able to get healthy, but now feels like he was healthy. Or more healthy than he's been this week. And hopefully moving forward, he will continue to be the productive player that we know he is. The second player at running back that I want to talk about here is Ray Davis, 28%. This one seems pretty obvious just because he's looked so good over the last 2 weeks. James Cook didn't play last week. And then even this week, he looked great and he had a rushing touchdown late in the game. It was kind of out of hand, but he did get in there quite a bit. It's not somebody necessarily that's going to have standalone value, but this is similar to it feels like anyways now, to the McCaffrey situation with Jordan Mason. Like if anything happens to Cook, Ray Davis is a locked and loaded starter. Set it and forget it. So when you have a handcuff that's that clear and that can be that good, you want to try to have that on your team as well if you have the starter. So call out to all James Cook owners listening to this. Go and add Ray Davis this week. Just figure out a way to get him on your roster. I know maybe you feel like you have a really good team or your bench is really deep. Ray Davis is somebody that is a starter for you. And we're not through the buys all the way. Obviously, that goes all the way until week 14. But we're through some of the buys. So if your bye weeks have kind of eased up, you have Dallas players, you have Detroit players, you have Chicago players. Maybe you don't need to be planning so much for the bye weeks coming ahead. Go and get Ray Davis on your teams. The last two guys here are the tight ends, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these guys because we already know who they are, and we've been talking about them a lot. The first one is Cade Otton. So this one plays into the injuries as well, right, to Evans and Godwin. Otton should step up more for sure, and he did in this game. He ended up with 8 catches for 100 yards. That is a massive day. They were looking for him early and often, and without the two major playmakers, I would guess that Otton is going to be similarly involved moving forward. It's going to be hard to keep him out of the top 10 tight ends and maybe even the top 8 tight ends moving forward until Evans is back or until they make a move at wide receiver, because there's just such a big target opportunity here for him now in a way that didn't exist before this. And he was already kind of trending up just because the offense was so good and he was getting more and more involved as the season had gone on. And so Cade Otton now feels like somebody that you actually would actively want to start in your tight end slot. If you've had Sam Laporta, for example, I have Sam Laporta in my main league, and I would rather be starting Otton at this point. So don't blame me at all. If you go and get him, he's only 42% roster. He should be up in the 75% range. The other tight end I want to talk about too briefly here. We talked about him last week's waiver wire. We talked about him beat the waiver wire. We're going to talk about him this week's waiver wire, and it's because he's still 30% rostered, and that's Hunter Henry for the Patriots. This is a very good player, and he's playing now with a quarterback that looks like he is also very good at moving the ball. So Henry is somebody that, again, he's unbecoming. He's had some bad games, but you look up at the overall tight end standings and he's inside the top 10 already based on how he's performed. And now he has improved quarterback play and likely more targets coming his way over the second half of the season. You want to get him on your team now if you can. So, get Hunter Henry onto your team. If you are in need of a tight end, or if you only have one tight end, I would recommend trying to get him on your bench as your second tight end, honestly. And he's somebody that you could possibly play in flex if you're in a pinch, and is probably going to be better than some of the wide receivers that are out there on your waiver wire anyways. So Hunter Henry is somebody I really like moving forward. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. We look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.